Hello again, here we are, the 15th, I think it is now, 15th question and answer session. I'm David Willey, I'm the curator at the Tank Museum. The Tank Museum, we're really pleased to say, is now open. You can book a ticket if you go online. You have to book in advance, and the galleries are now open. We haven't opened the archive and library yet, and obviously with everything going on, there's new measures in place for COVID-19. But I'm going to be continuing these questions and answers at home. Not all of the staff are in. I haven't got access. I can pop into the archive and library every now and again, so I am being able to find out answers to one or two questions people have posed, as well as using my material here at home. And I'm joined as ever by Finn the dog, and those of you who know the format, I try and get you to buy some of the things from our online shop as well, which is a great income source at this particular time, where obviously as an independent charity, money is always going to be a major issue, and what with having lost the last few months worth of visitor income, you know, it's quite an important thing that we try and keep ourselves going this way. So let's get on with the questions. I'm going to start actually by going back to a previous question and answer where I was telling you all about pigeons and communication in First World War and a couple of stories, and I just came across another great one. Robert Crisp was a cricketer, international cricketer, and he served in tanks in RTR in World War II, and in his book Brazen Chariots, I just thought I'd read you this lovely one. And before I do, here we go. As per usual, Finn seems to know this is a trigger. As soon as I start talking at the camera, here's a trigger for him to get going with the ball. Anyway, I'm going to read you this one. They're out in North Africa in the desert. They've just been going on an exercise. A rather odd thing happened to me at this time. I'd been sent out in charge of a small recce party in a 1,500 weight truck to see what the going was like ahead of our area. We'd come across a soft patch of soft sand, and in which the truck got stuck and needed a good deal of manhandling to get out. With 2 or 3 others, I was pushing and heaving at the back of the vehicle, cursing volubly as the wheels spun around, kicking up the desert into our eyes and ears. When there was a sudden soft fluttering noise in my ear, and I felt a light touch on my back. I took a casual glance from the corner of my eye and was amazed to see a pigeon sitting on my shoulder. Nobody else had noticed it. And as I stopped and straightened, I put my hand up slowly, expecting any second that the bird would take fright and fly off again. Instead, it seemed to come willingly into my hand, where it snuggled down contentedly. Only then did I notice the tube of white paper fastens to its leg by a piece of elastic. I called to the others. They gaped when they saw what I was holding and walked back towards me. I pointed to the piece of paper. "A carrier pigeon," said Harry McGrath. "How the hell did you get hold of that?" McGrath was an Australian troop commander in C Squadron. We had been in England and Greece together when his ancient tank had broken down somewhere in Macedonia. He had jumped on the back of mine with a few other bods. We were great friends. While I gently slid the elastic off the pigeon's leg, I told them what had happened. There was a strange air of unreality about the whole thing which impressed all of us. As far as I know, we were 10 or 15 miles from the nearest British formation. There was nothing in sight except sand, rock and scrub. What was this mysterious paper that had come fluttering down on my shoulder from an empty sky above an empty land? A message from some remote patrol lost in the desert? Could it be a German carrier pigeon with a secret signal from their high command? The others clustered round, caught in the mystery of the moment, holding their breath while I unfolded the curled slip. It made a dry rustling sound that could have been heard 20 yards away. Slowly I opened it out, until the penciled message lay revealed. It was in English and said simply, "Bugger you, leave me alone." There was a moment of shocked incredulity, and then we burst into simultaneous roars. It was a good 10 minutes before we recovered enough wind to start pushing again. And he goes on and discussed the possibilities of where it might have come from, whether it was a bit of a set-up by some of the other blokes for the LAD lorry, etc. But anyway, I just thought I'd throw that one in. Another pigeon story. It's amazing how they keep coming to light all over the place. And also in Bob's Christ account, which is a really, really good account, he also mentioned that perennial subject which constantly comes up, the British and tea. He says here, when they're going out, "The first grey light in the east awoke me and brought slow, reluctant movement to the whole column. We got permission for a quick brew. the mug of tea which was to become very nearly the most important institution in the Desert War. God knows how many gallons of precious petrol were used up during that and subsequent campaigns in bringing kettles to the boil. Half-hearted attempts were made to prevent it while armoured regiments lay stranded with empty petrol tanks, but generals and brigadiers as well as troopers and privates came to recognise the moral effect of a brew, and it was never seriously discouraged. In the grim days and nights that followed November the 18th, it was incredible but not an unusual sight to see some tank crew, temporarily immobile or disengaged but still under fire, huddled over a sand and petrol stove making tea. It was also inevitable during any sort of lull in the battle to hear some voice on the air calling up the CO and saying, hello Jago, two calling, may we brew up? Once in the middle of an action down near El Gubi, many days and many lives later, we heard a distinctive Teuton voice saying on our regimental wireless frequently, hello Baloo, calling, you may brew up. The battle paused while the whole regiment rocked with laughter. I have no doubt some died laughing. The Germans obviously were on our wavelengths as well and thought that would be a good one to do. So tea, as ever, it's one of those subject matters which gives me a good excuse to say if you haven't bought it, there's your nice tea ration tin that you can buy with the tea bags in, which I think I said there we go, is Ceylon tea bags in there. And let me throw the ball for Finn. And right, on with some questions then. Organic Int asks a question about are there any of the Shervicks around? I honestly don't know. What the Shervick, I think I've done this story before in another question and answer, but perhaps not these general ones. After the Second World War, the British government out in what was then still a colony, Tanganyika, had something called the groundnut scheme, which was one of these bright ideas that just went ridiculously wrong. It was basically to grow peanuts out in one of the colonies, and you'd employ veterans to do it, and it would bring in much needed income and obviously a food source, etc. And in 1947, Vickers, they sent out tractors first of all. They didn't really work out there. They then thought, well, let's use some old Sherman tanks. Vickers rebuilt Shermans to make them into basically tractors to plough the ground. And they went out there, and the whole project was just sort of one disaster after another, and in the end cost millions and millions of pounds and just basically didn't really get anywhere. Whether there's any out there still, I have got no idea whether they were actually scrapped out there or bothered to be brought back. I think it was kind of like, you know, one of those ones everyone was more inclined to forget the whole operation, I think. But interestingly, because then we get this, you know, is there a secondary use for tanks? Yes, there has been sort of attempts to build dozers out of them. That's probably one of the most famous one, making this thing they called the Shervick, Sherman and Vickers, that was the name, Shervick. And but there was there's a Canadian company that again I believe is still going. Moorpack is it? I believe the company is. And they in Canada they took Shermans and they were using the hulls of Shermans as part of the logging industry, and they'd be drilling holes to put pylons in and all sorts of bits and pieces out in Canada. And I think they've still got a website. I remember some time ago looking up to see if they, you know, what they still have, but you can still commission a vehicle based on a Sherman hull, I believe, out there, and they do the spare parts for them too. Trinity 118 asks, what's the frame on a Challenger 2? That tabletop arrangement that's above the turret. You were thinking, is it ECM? Yes, it is. It's electronic countermeasures equipment that goes on that table. Obviously, they keep very hush-hush what the different things are and quite what they can do. But basically, most vehicles now have some sort of, especially after Iraq, Afghanistan, etc., roadside bombs, ways of interrupting things, stopping a signal getting through. So there's lots of interesting things on that tabletop arrangement, and it's the simplest way they could actually find of putting it there. It looks a bit ugly. Well, I won't say the word ugly, it just looks a bit clumsy, doesn't it, on the back? But it's full of very interesting gadgets, and like so many things to do with the electronic countermeasures, consistently new issues arrive and therefore the arrangements change that are on there. So I hope that answers that particular question. Sandro Wallach says, how do we move dead tanks at the museum? You know, every time we must do it, destroy the floors. We have a Centurion ARV that's very good because it doesn't pump out much in the way of fumes. We have a a dozer, a Terex dozer that's kind of like one of these whopping great big dozer, rubber track pads we've put on it so it doesn't chew up the floor too much. That's very good for fine manoeuvring. And we also have a Challenger and a Chieftain ARV or AARV, and they are also used in manoeuvring things around. We did try a trolley system, didn't really get it to work. You need the Canadian War Memorial Museum, you know, fantastic one out there, has got beautiful brand new concrete floors, so it's got a system, and I've seen one guy, he's able to pull a whole Panther tank around on basically a trolley system that then is raised, inflates as it were, and one person can manoeuvre things very easily that way. But that's because you've got a good floor as well. And one of our issues is in some of the galleries we've got brand new heavy duty concrete floor, hard wearing, you know, you can manoeuvre things on, yes, a rubber pants will leave a mark, etc. In other areas, we have one building that was put over basically the thin tarmac that used to be the car park, so you'll actually see the ruts in there where vehicles have sat for a while, or on a hot day, you know, bits have melted and everything. And other areas are aging, how can I put it politely? You know, they flake a lot, they've been breaking up, they were never designed in the first place for the amount of time and what goes on in there. So one of the kind of answers to your question is yes, we do. In our World War II gallery, we tend to destroy the floor every time we do a major move. And that probably means poor old Matt, our maintenance Matt, has to repaint the floor. And as you go in and you'll see the World War II gallery, you know, a lick of paint does an awful lot and it hides a lot. Truth is, underneath it all, there's a lot of delaminating, older layers of concrete, tarmac. And some of this stuff, of course, you know, after it's had oil and petrol and goodness knows what over decades quietly dripping into it, it's made it all go soft and gooey in some areas, and other areas are just flaking away, and you know, you kind of almost can tap across it and you hear the hollow bits, and you know that's a bit that's going to come off if something big and heavy runs across. And there's also a drainage system in there that collapses every now and again, much to all our joy. So it's not an easy thing, but different organisations have got, you know, come up with different things, but you tend to use a recovery tank or a dozer to be able to manoeuvre doing that you know, initial moves in and out, which is why I get it right, because there's not going to be any of this, let's have another go at that, or we put the wrong in the wrong place. So again, as part of this last World War II move, Mike Hayton did his model and does all that working out, because you can imagine, you know, you've got to leave yourself, if you're towing a vehicle or pushing a vehicle, have you got room for that second vehicle all the time? And think of the tow bars and think of how you're going to do this, because you're not getting a second attempt, or if you get something wrong at the back, you know, it's all a really big chess game that you really need to keep on top of. Where did it go? Oh, there we go. Slurper tea, which again, don't forget to order your tea from our shop. And you too can buy an I Love Tanks mug from our shop, or a Panther one that we've got down the front there. Right, another question. What is it? Kieran Dunbar asked the question: what's the advantage over towed anti-tank guns over self-propelled anti-tank guns? And you know, why didn't basically everything end up going on top of some form of chassis? Number of answers to that, really. I would say costs, because actually creating a mobile vehicle to put the anti-tank gun on is going to cost you more money than just having whether it's horses or another tow vehicle, which tends to be cheaper than an armoured and a track vehicle, which doesn't last as long, etc. So those cost and resource implications. The other thing as well, so if you think of the Second World War, the Germans, we always go on about how, you know, vast amounts of their transportation, etc., was all horse-drawn. That was a political decision. That wasn't just an accident for the Germans in a sense. It was a reality that they didn't have access to fuel supplies. So there's no point in some ways trying to go for motorisation in an enormous sense if you can't actually fuel them, whereas there's always a bit of grass or fodder around. So that idea of using the horse seems more sensible. So there's economic and strategic considerations to make. You know, how many vehicles can you sustain, rather than just saying, oh, you know, a self-propelled one would be better. And of course the Germans, you know, right from the beginning of the war, they're looking at, first of all, the towed 88, soft half tracks, you know, or soft skin, I say the word, you know, unarmoured vehicles like a FAMO 8-tonner towing an 8.8 flat gun. They then convert some of those, and they've already got the idea of the flat gun going on top of that FAMO 8-ton vehicle, and then they armour plate it and they do other things with it to give the crew some sort of protection, because they can see the advantage of that tracked and wheeled mobility that a self-propelled gun has in certain circumstances. So it can get out of trouble, it can keep up with the advancing armour if you're tracked, etc. So there's, you know, horses for courses there, but actually it's a sheer numbers game. You're not unlikely, or you're very unlikely to be able to make enough to do that with everything. So towed artillery or towed anti-tank guns is a much more likely way you're going to be able to deploy a larger number of anti-tank guns. And the Americans, the British, however rich we may have seen in tracked vehicles or armoured vehicles to be able to do that with, and of course we have our M10s, we have all sorts of ways, we have Archers, so they do this, but there is still a vaster quantity of batteries that are being towed by other types of vehicles, whether it's soft skin or brain gun carrier or armoured vehicles. And that idea as well is it means that you can also, on the whole, although this is where it got a bit silly towards the end with things like the German Pak 43 or the 17-pounder, they are getting big, but on the whole, a towed anti-tank gun is also easier to conceal, harder target to spot, and as we always go on about as well, we always talk tanks, tank against tank, top trump stuff all the time, when in actual fact, the biggest killer of tanks on both fronts in the war is anti-tank guns. So that is, you know, they are still a very, very potent force out there. You know, that is what soldiers or tank commanders are looking out for the most, is trying to spot the anti-tank guns, because they can be hidden so well, they can be manoeuvred relatively quickly out the way. They may not be as mobile as a tracked vehicle, but you know, very, very effective use of your, again, and I come back to all the time, even in wartime, limited budgets. You know, you only have a finite amount of resource. What do we put it into? Yes, self-propelled anti-tank guns sound fantastic. German Sturmgeschütz is very effective, etc. But the truth is, again, actually we want more, and it's cheaper to build them as towed ones. Drop the ball, Finn. So I hope that kind of slightly answers that sort of a question there. Right, Andy Pedrosa says, how do you have such a great beard? Well, I will answer that question. Like all the beard owners that are out there, it's by clean living and pure thoughts. That's the way to get a great beard. A number of people have talked about, especially with Finn around and everything, talking about animals, animal mascots. You know, what is it with the animals and military? And I forgot to bring it out. I'll go and find the image and I'll tag it on at the end. There's a great photo of a tank crew with their collie dog, just like Finn. And I've said it before, you know, is it because in the time of the stress of war that people just like latching on to something they can show their emotions to, they might not be able to in the wider, you know, why is it every time you see groups of soldiers somewhere along the line, especially when they're in a group photo taken, there's a couple of dogs sitting in the front, and this, you know, for tanks, World War I. But I just thought I'd bring another animal in that doesn't always get you don't associate it, but right in that very first tank attack, a tank called Dracula, commanded by Lieutenant Drader, and I've got in here, he ended up, and there's footage, so if you go online and look at World War I tanks, etc., there's some absolute footage. I can't remember if it's Malins, the cameraman, but it's a well-recognised piece of footage. It's used in the Battle of the Ancre film, which comes out later on, the March of the Tanks, which again, lots of people after the Battle of the Somme film, when they realised how popular that film was and it got to more people, all the stats they come out with, more people saw it when it came out than Star Wars and all this sort of stuff, you know, hugely popular, very influential on the British public. They followed it up with this second film, and in that film you'll see a Mark I tank with the crew just getting inside, including Lieutenant Drader, and he hands forward a kitten called Percy, and Percy goes in the tank and off they go. And Percy is kind of like, it starts off as there it is, it goes into battle with them, it does other bits and pieces, but this idea where animals become also, this phrase mascot, some sort of talisman, something that the crew like as well. And this is a letter that Drader writes back after, where are we? Let me just find the right bit. Here we go. He writes back after the 15th of September when Percy the cat goes into action. The crew had another joyride the day before yesterday at dawn, and as before behaved splendidly, even better results than on the 15th. Sorry, this is after the 15th, that first attack. The black kitten, which is nearly cat-sized now, seems to being us more. I do apologise, there's a spelling mistake, but it seems to bring us more and more luck. I don't think the crew would part with it for anything. So very quickly, a pet becomes more. It becomes, you know, a talisman, a mascot, a sort of representative. And he goes on, and the nice story about Percy is Drader actually ends up, survives the war. He's in a number of other tank attacks, survived the war, goes off, I think he becomes a mining engineer in Romania for a while, and then heads off and he ends up in California. Percy survives and comes back, and there's a picture of Percy the cat with his sister after the war, and that's all in the first tank cruise by Stephen Pope, which is an amazing piece of work that Stephen did, and is still working on First World War tank cruise, you know, picking up that personal stories about them all. So have a look out for that footage. It's around the place. I think we've got it on some of our websites somewhere and being used for something. But we always associate so many times it's dogs because, you know, sometimes they've got a military use as well as, you know, warning, etc. But that one I love. There's another great one as well, just mentioning it, which is the duck, or is it a goose? I can't remember exactly, which I think is at the Guards Museum. It alerted the sleeping troops at the approach of the enemy, and when it died years later, they've got its head stuffed in this case with a voice bubble coming out of it saying alarm, alarm. So, you know, a lot of military museums, there's some great animal story or stuffed animal there, and I've told you also about the pigeons before. So yeah, we can talk about mascot stories, and there's great ones all the way through. And there's a really good book as well, I think it's by oh God, I'll find the reference for you. But anyway, but there's a First World War one where the guy's just done basically a whole book of those animal stories and the reasonings, and how after you start looking at it, they fall into category. There's working animals, you know, just think of the relationship with the horses in the First World War and Second World War and other times. There's working dogs, there's other animals, mules, asses, etc. There's ones that are kept as pets. There's the fact that soldiers, you know, because they've got a lot of time there, especially in the trenches, where they get to start just, you know, as a lot of us have been doing, I guess, in lockdown, is suddenly you're much more aware of nature again. So they become ornithologists, books are written about the bird life on the Western Front, you know, studies are done at certain things, as well as the other side, which is the hunting, shooting, fishing side, which is, you know, what have we got an opportunity? So those guys out in the desert, you know, they're, as Robert Chris says, you know, some of them, of course, are actually, if we can go and shoot some sort of, you know, gazelle or antelope or something like that, that's also meat for the table. So there's a good reason why you might be out going doing these things. Right, on with the other questions. So, Christopher Papas brings up Finn, and he says, why aren't we selling Finn autographs or photographs? Come here, Finn, drop it round here, drop. Well, and I didn't bring it out this time, but if you go to the shop and have a look, and I know some of you already ordered them, thanks very much. If you buy your Finn puppet, you actually get a signature from Finn as part of the Finn puppet deal. So there was me out there with some poster paint, and I think I'm using the invite cards for Tankfest, which we couldn't use anymore. And there was me with some poster paint, getting his pad to give signatures to everyone who bought one of the puppets. So if that's the way you want a signature, have a go on that one. David Keith asked the question, any more reports on Herman the German, the supposed ghost in the Tank Museum? Comes up as subject with junior leaders. Every time I bump into people who used to be in the Junior Leaders Regiment, which was across the road from where the museum is in Stanley Barracks, they're the ones that always remember the Herman the German story. And I have to say it was one of those stories that was kind of a set thing that was done by the NCOs, which is, oh, you don't want to go in there, there's a ghost, etc. Half of it, I think, to just make sure, because they were supposed to patrol the museum at night. I've met them all, you know, some of them were issued with a pickaxe handle, and the joke of the ghost of Herman the German in the museum carried on with that one, and quite often every new intake there'd be some poor chap would be sat down told the story, and basically he'd come back from his night patrol as if he'd seen a ghost and was sat there, and they'd all play this act. So all the rest of them, you know, what, you saw something? Yeah, I saw something. And, you know, they have to give him a drink, calm him down and everything, as if that was a thing. But and that went on, and every year, every intake sort of thing. I've never seen Herman the German, and I don't think anyone else has, but it was one of those stories that comes back, which touches on junior leaders, because junior leaders were these bright chaps who joined at 16. I don't know if you watched at the weekend, Richard Cutland. He started life as a junior leader over the road, and at one point it was a hugely successful scheme. You could join at 16, and they kind of, you know, these were going to be the sergeants, the leaders, everything else in the army. That was the intention, to give them a bit more, the brighter ones, a bit more oomph as they were going through that system. Very, very successful. At one point, just about every sergeant major, I think it was regimental sergeant major in the Armoured Corps, had been a junior leader, and they stopped the scheme some years ago, and there was talk about reinstating it because it had been so successful. But that comes over because over the road, Glyn Morrison asked the question, why isn't there anything showing about the Junior Leaders Regiment? Well, there is, Glyn. If you are visiting the museum, go in there. We've got a big, there is a display on it, and that whopping great mural that used to be in the Junior Leaders, I think it was in the canteen and the gym at one point, that's been re-erected in the museum. So there's a whole bit on Junior Leaders there. So if you want to go and have a look at that, that's in there. Viking 5 asked the question, how do you retreat in a tank? Depends on the position, depends on where you are, if it's a fighting withdrawal, etc. Because don't forget, a tank with a 360 turret, you can still face the enemy, you can still engage as the driver's going in the other direction. But again, if you look at some of those videos that are online as well, which talk about this phrase jockeying, about how you would overwatch, you would cover a tank that is retreating to its next position, then this tank would move while this one's covering it, etc. That's how you tend to do that. And then ultimately, once you're out of what you might call line of sight or obvious firing range of where you think the enemy threat is, that's when you might then form into column and start doing like a road march backwards as well, sort of thing. But that's one of the great advantages of a tank with a 360 turret. You can still engage the enemy even if you're heading in the other direction. D. Wiggins and a number of people asked, following up on that when I was talking about Lend-Lease, asked the question, how much did Britain pay? Well, Britain actually had, in terms of afterwards, Lend-Lease basically was given at a 90% discount, and after the war, because of all the bills and everything else, also the US gave a great big loan at 2% to the UK as well, as part of a whole series of, you know, then there comes Marshall Aid, there's all sorts of different things for helping to rebuild Europe. So in terms of, we only paid about 10% of the actual value of the items of Lend-Lease, and I've got down that $354 billion was the total there. And somebody else also asked, you know, 1.3 billion went to the USSR. Wartime value, about $2 million of raw materials and certain items went from the USSR back to the USA as payment, because everyone then says, did Russia or the USSR, Soviet Union, pay back that Lend-Lease as Britain did? And basically, no, they didn't. They offered money at the end of the Second World War, a certain amount of money as in payment. There was, you know, the usual legal thing, Cold War, everyone having a spat type thing. But to do with grain imports, exports as well, in 1972, a settlement was reached with the USA by the Soviet Union, and they paid $772 million to the USA to sort of kind of like clear the debt, as it were, and that also helped other things happen at the time. So these are big figures floating around there, and of course somebody else made the point that you know, if you actually look at in terms of who was doing the fighting, who was losing the most people, etc., the phrase, you know, kind of like the Soviet Union and Russia paid in blood. No two ways about it. It was vast amounts of equipment was going from the USA. But if you're being cynical about it, that was such a good investment because it meant really the Russians were doing on the Eastern Front, that meat grinder exercise of fighting the mass of the German military all the time. And if you do that in comparison with after D-Day in the Western Front, yes, let's not deny this was all vitally important stuff. But actually in sheer statistics and numbers and losses, it was the Soviet Union that was suffering the most. So again, that's another one of these, do you just talk about money or do you talk about national effort and national loss as well in terms of people? Patrick Mack, I think comes across as, he asked, what does the north end of the orchard mean? It was supposed to be humorous, missed the point there somehow, but all around me I've got some apple trees here, by the way. Apples, okay, that makes cider. So just as you wine connoisseur, a bit of a joke says, north end of the vineyard, as if you can tell that this bottle is made from grapes from a certain place in the vineyard, not just the grape variety, the vineyard's name itself, etc. So one might argue that you could tell, same for apples, if you're sampling some cider, that I was jokingly saying north end of the orchard, which at the time I thought was funny, and now I've explained it all. It doesn't sound funny at all, does it? But there we are. So that answers that one. Bill D in Iowa asked the question, how many tanks did the Germans make in World War II? And as it's Bill D in Iowa, how many tanks did the Germans make in World War II? All told, there is good. The Germans were very good at their record keeping, and most of those records survived. So there is a very fine figure. Totally, Germany, from basically when they start making tanks with the rise of the Nazis, 1930s on 33 onward, they make overall 49,777. So 49,777, 3,503 of those were made before 1939. So that vast majority obviously made during the actual war years. And again, there's good sources that tell you the breakdowns of each different type, etc. But it just gives you an idea of that business, because when we were coming out with these great figures about the T-34, and the point a number of people came back is one of the other issues, of course, is when you're counting tanks, is every tank, does it have to be a brand new tank? But what if it's a tank that goes back to the factory, gets re-equipped, upgraded, goes out? What if it's a tank that gets knocked out, goes back to the factory and actually, is rebuilt? Is that a new tank or is it another one? So that's why sometimes these figures can look a little bit, hang on a second, whose do I believe and what's the real figure there? Let me take a slurp of tea. But anyway, I hope that answers your question. Bill D in Iowa. Bill D in Iowa. Come here. Come and drop it then. Good boy. Tank-a-lot asks, Eleanor and Harry, the two children, want to know what's happened to the KV-1. Is it still white? KV-1 is still white, but it's not in the new World War II display. The new World War II galleries is all about the British tank soldiers' experience in the Second World War, so British tanks and what they were fighting against on the whole. So it is, you'll still be able to see it's in the Vehicle Conservation Centre at the moment, the VCC, and it's still white. We haven't actually, we haven't changed the paint scheme on it. And much to everyone's disgust, I think there's a wrong letter on the inscription, the Cyrillic writing on the side, so everyone gets worked up about that. Another sucker asked the question, is the day of massed armoured war over? How do you answer that one? Very hard predicting the future. I did used to question though, we used to have a big board when I first went to the Tank Museum and it said Kursk, the biggest tank battle of all time, or no, actually even said it was Kursk, the biggest tank battle that ever was and ever will be equivalent, because as if like there would never be those many tanks again. My question is, I think predicting the future, we were talking, is it just going to be unmanned vehicles, drones, it'll all be cyber warfare, it'll be this, won't it? Just look what happened recently with the China-India border dispute. Because of the banning of certain types of firearms in that area, that border dispute leading to the loss of lives took place with clubs and pickaxe handles and throwing stones. And that's, well, what are we, 2020? So when people start saying you won't see this again, you won't see that again, it's just amazing how constantly these things seem to come back and whatever the technology, it'll end up being some poor little infantryman sitting in a foxhole somewhere, grabbing himself. And in the end, as in the Korean War and as in so many conflicts, sometimes coming down to you throwing stones at each other. So this idea we move on, whether you can actually talk about that as a term when you talk about warfare, it's my issue about when we talk about these things. There are still huge numbers of tanks out there in the world. And the nature of warfare, we don't think, do we? Because depending on where you're living, it's going to kick off in that manner. But I look at China, look at India, two great examples there with big tank fleets. If they ended up having a non-nuclear, non-chemical war, it is likely that those two big tank fleets could be engaged with each other. So you could still have tank engagements with scale that's bigger than the Second World War. So that, engagement, so the possibilities, sadly, are still out there, that type of thing could happen again in the future. You throw this one. So, is the day of mass armour war over? May well be, but I would not put money on it. TDM Airsoft said he's getting exciting because he's heading for us on the 19th of July. Thank you for that, but and also those of you who have come in, thank you for coming back. I was stopped in the car park, which made me laugh because suddenly I wondered why this guy was pulling up his trouser legs and he was showing off the socks he'd bought from the shop just to make the point that he'd bought them there. And I loved it as well, where they're going back in, where you see people going round, because not only just for staff, it's good at last seeing the public back in the galleries rather than empty galleries and things. But I also noticed as well, there's whatever your age, whatever, we're all like little schoolboys, aren't we, at heart, when we actually get to see and do things we want to do. And there were so many blokes walking around, or with the kids as well, I have to say, with that beaming look on their face, like at last they were able to do something they wanted to do, and they were excited about it. And it was really good as well, because we've been busy doing lots of different things, and it's really nice watching. And especially, I keep going back to come and look at that new World War II hall and the new galleries we've got there, because the stories in it, what it looked like, the presentation of the vehicles and things that way, really very, very good. And that's what I like watching the audience sometimes, what they're engaging, what have they got the story in the way that we wanted them to get it, is it the wife that's calling hubby over, say, look, read this, with choking up a bit with the emotive bits in some of the cases that was really there. So you're not the only one who got excited. I can say that, TMD Airsoft, when you come along, so you'll see lots of other excited people, and it's just nice as well. I think obviously with everything that's going on and still going on, sadly, I think it's just been good to see people who have been able to get out safely. We've got all the arrangements in place, etc. Suddenly sort of seeing things that they like and want to do. Another slurp on the tea. Time for tea. Oh, look at that timing. Asked the question, was there an APCR round for the 6-pounder in tanks? Yes, there was. And what is APCR? AP, armour piercing, I think most of us know about that. CR, composite rigid. So what's that mean? So composite rigid, we know about discarding sabots. So you put a slug of a denser metal like tungsten in a lighter pot, so it fills the cavity of the barrel, gets all the force behind it, discarding sabot, discarding, in other words, the sabot part, the shoe or the piece around the outside falls away, leaving the slug going forward. With armour piercing composite rigid, composite because you've got and rigid, it's together. You've got the slug of tungsten, but then you have a lighter alloy around it, but it doesn't fall away. So it's a whole piece, composite rigid together. And that again, they do a round like that for the 6-pounder. And it's used anti-tank guns and in the tank as well for the 6-pounder. So time for tea, there you go. And I didn't slurp my tea, so I will. Mihi, who I think got out of bed the wrong side when he tried to put his question down. If you ask the question again, but try and be clearer in what you're actually asking, because I know someone else tried to answer you, and it's probably a better way of think about, am I going to get what the question is, or as others were trying to and didn't quite get what you were trying to ask the question. And Someone charmingly called Cock Monkey asked the question. He said, oh, no, he doesn't. He makes a comment. He says he loves to have questions and answers on. I love to have it on while doing something else, then zoom in for the really interesting bits. Thanks. And Jamie from Oxford asked the questions, did the Americans encourage the British to standardise when we went, back to Lend-Lease and all those other things, when we went to America? At first, we were trying to put in orders for what tanks we wanted with the Americans. Then the Americans get going, because they've already got going, with the M3 and then with the M4 Sherman tank. They do adjust to British requests, but basically say, listen, if we're going to build these in one fell swoop in large numbers, you guys really ought to buy into what we're doing, hence Lend-Lease tanks, rather than saying, well, let's have, a couple of hundred of these and let's have something else that way. And so that advantage of mass scale, etc., which is what Britain ends up doing. But we do influence the American tank design. So the Sherman and the Grant, etc., there are differences. So think of the Grant and the Lee. So think of the turret. We like the radios being in the turrets. Think of things such as the 2-inch mortar that goes in the top of the tank. So there are differences, but they are not as fundamental. So yes, the Americans are successful at saying to the British, look, yeah, that's great that you want this sort of thing, but why don't you come along and we'll just standardise because of the advantages, again, all this time of standardisation, mass production, costs, huge quantities, spare parts in numbers, and that so often when you look at earlier in the war just didn't seem to be working in that way. So too often in British tank production, certainly earlier in the war, the tank may have come out, it's been hastily built, tends to be bespoke on the whole. Everything seems to be, it's not like a simplified, mass-produced, every vehicle is almost hand-built individually with differences. So, that same piece of armour you thought would have fitted an engine deck on anyone in that model. No, this one is cut slightly differently for this one because this one is, quarter of an inch out in this piece. And when we did the Matilda, we were finding all these marks all over it, of adjustments and such like. And also the really big one as well that we sometimes overlook is spare parts. That idea of standardised parts can keep coming. So when something goes wrong, off it comes and another one, straight out the box and on there. And if you can repair the first one, fine, that goes back down the line. But you don't have to be doing that in the field all the time. And that's where, again, that American mass production and touches on earlier when I was saying about the Soviet Union, okay, the idea that yes, there was Sherman tanks often belittled supposedly by Soviet historians afterwards, and everything else. Actually, the amount of equipment that things like GMC trucks, industrial production, a whole Ford rubber tyre plant was uplifted and sent out to the Soviet Union. So that keeping the engine of the Soviet military going, that's where Lend-Lease really, really important. Some of it cutting edge weaponry, but some of it was also, the GMC truck was basically, what the Soviets were relying on in the Second World War. So that's a number of the questions there. As ever, we've gone on and on and on. I'll show you some of the bits and pieces. I think some of these, I was trying to think of the new ones and what you've seen before. I didn't even know about these things, but here we go. We've got some of these Meng models. But it says on the back here, I didn't even understand this, but it's to do with the game. But what they do is they're almost like cartoon versions of Toons, Toons. And so you can buy your Panther or your Sherman Firefly, and they're kind of like a Sherman Firefly before it grows up for some reason. They're sort of done as a kid's version as the model. So have a look at those ones. So we do those if that's your boat. Some other nice ones we got in the cheaper books. He says, if I get rid of this for the dog. This one, Sigler's War. This was a chap who served out on the Western Front, and he did little cartoony type drawings of his whole service. And the interesting thing, whether you like the artwork or not, the interesting thing is that's his record with his diary. So he illustrates it, but it's what a soldier who was a signaller in the First World War gets up to as a job. That's the thing that I think when I was looking at it came across as well. Anyway, you've got one of those, £3.99, so if you're into your First World War stuff. Patrick Bishop's written on their war and the RAF for quite a number of years. Air Force Blue, so if you like your RAF stories, really good overall view of what it was like for the aircrew in the Second World War and the characters in there. Actually some lovely, I was just looking earlier, some of those lovely colour photographs of all those guys. Anyway, yeah, that's another good one there. If you're Alamein, always still that crucial battle. Why is it so important? You know, again, I mentioned earlier, numbers nowhere near what was going on the Eastern Front, but strategically meant we were going to win in North Africa and that Middle East theatre. Because again, just remembering, if Rommel had won, he could have gone through Egypt. There was talk of coming down from the Caucasus and joining up that way. That put pay to anything like that. So Alamein, and again, you know, the lessons learned bits and everything, that's a good one there. And I think I mentioned this one before, but some cracking, again, if you're a First World War fan, $3.99, interpretation of aerial photographs on the Western Front, and there's some significant ones there. I was looking at some of these ones where they've been able to pick out tanks and everything on the Western Front. So Western Front from the air. And again, £3.99. Some of these are really good books in terms of for the money or what you're getting. The usual I will do if you want your feeling guilty about anything in the order, or you just want to top it up by your shortbread or shortbread rounds, mini ones there, for whatever reason, like whether this should become the dog toy, but don't forget the fin puppets as well. I've mentioned already the mugs. Inflatable shells still selling very well, so there's our 17-pounder and our 88, and don't forget we've got the armour piercing Sherman one. Apparently someone was asking, I had to point that one out. Yes, we do those like a trench whistle. That's going to confuse everyone. This one's actually got the Broad Arrow 1916 stamped on it. But if you fancy, if you need a whistle, there's your dog whistle or something else, and you come out with that, then you can proudly show, not only with your tank museum socks, but you can show that you've actually got a 1916 trench whistle to be looking at. Those of you, again, presents, I know a couple of people have come back and said thanks very much, the kids did buy it, well done, because they took the hint and everything. Gentlemen, or if you've got a gentleman to buy for, Royal Armoured Corps hip flask with the RAC badge on the front there, that the mailed fist with Queen's crown on the top, so you can get your nice little proper pewter. And actually I was just checking up, and it is actually a really pucker one, Whitworth, it's proper pewter, all stamped on the bottom, made in Sheffield, so proper English made hip flask there. So nicer presents ones if you're looking at someone's birthdays. And other ones we've got as well, pewter tankards. And again, they're all pucker ones, they're all stamped and everything else that way. You can buy a pewter tankard with a tiger on, or you can buy a pewter tankard, there's a little half pint there with RTR. So if you've got an RTR relative or something else that way, Royal Tank Regiment, there we are. There's a good idea for his birthday, Christmas, whatever it is that you fancy. Have a look on the website as well. We've got other ones on there, I think, as well. I've mentioned the tea. I have to go through my my fridge magnet collection, so here we can go again. Tigers, and all sorts of challenges there. Things as well, if you're bothering to put them in the order, it's not going to cost anything on the postage, is it? We could all do with these sometimes, so there's your memory stick with the Tank Museum on, so you can pick up one of those ones. I seem to remember, could I remember doing these last time? I can't remember, but anyway, you can get your Tank Museum bag with a tiger on if you fancy a tiger. So the tea towels went down. Thank you very much for the comments. Someone bought his Centurion, was it? Uncle, Dad served in Centurion, so he's very happy with his one. Naval tea towels as well. So if you've got someone from the Navy, did I do that the right way around? He says, I think I have, yes. So you can have Navy tea towels as well as, I'll repeat the Centurion one because I just think it's such a lovely drawing. So there's the Centurion tea towel, there's that one. And I forgot my man with his silly cut-out person that I normally put these on, but these are, I believe, what you'll call hoodies, and so you can have tigers or our tank development. Nice one there as well. So that's the sales pitch bit, but do, as I keep saying, have a look on the website. If you've tried to order something before and it wasn't there, or we'd run out, go and have a look. We may have restocked, and we keep working on the postage issues, because I know sometimes it looks like it's going to be a terrible amount of postage. We keep working on those ones, and I know, thank you for those who've come back and said, brilliant, you've managed to halve the postage cost for me, so it then becomes worth ordering. And thank you also for those of you who are doing just a donation. So, you know, if you don't want to buy anything but you want to support us one way, either join our friends scheme or just pop a donation in there as well, or I think it's called a tip or something, isn't it, at the end there. So there's other ways you can just donate, and as I keep saying, you know, that's really important for us, because it means we keep going as a charity. We can keep doing the videos, and we can keep that museum going. So fingers crossed, we are open. If you've got the opportunity to come and have a look, you know, please do. And I just want to say thanks as ever, you know, so this won't be the last one. We'll keep going for a little bit longer, see how all this goes in terms of, you know, with our visitor numbers and everything. And Finn, come back around here. Oh, knocking everything over. And don't forget, you can get your Finn puppet with a signature from Finn. And he says thank you very much for all the attention and the nice kind words that have been given that way. I better let you go. Thank you as ever. Well done. In these difficult times, obviously your support is really valued. So please do keep following us on social media, do subscribe to our channel, and if you've got the opportunity, perhaps order something from our shop, join one of our schemes like Patreon or our Friends organisation, and we'll try and keep going with giving you some content to keep you informed and entertained.